What you're about to hear is a story that unravels the fine line between routine and disaster, where a combination of small, seemingly manageable factors can culminate in a chain of events that no one saw coming. This is the tale of a flight that, by all standards, should have gone as planned, but didn't. In the 1970s, Pacific Western Airlines, PWA, ran an extensive network connecting cities across the vast and rugged interior of Western and Northern Canada. While owned by the provincial government of Alberta, it also served neighboring British Columbia, including the city of Cranbrook, nestled in the Rocky Mountains near the U.S. border. On the afternoon of February 11, 1978, the crew of PWA Flight 314 was preparing to operate a scheduled service from Calgary, Alberta, to Cranbrook. The aircraft they were about to fly was a Boeing 737-200, one of the earliest versions of the Boeing 737 family. While now an iconic jetliner, this particular model was uniquely suited for remote destinations, like those served by PWA, thanks to its rugged frame, reliable engines, and the ability to be fitted with gravel kits, allowing it to land on dirt runways. However, Cranbrook was not one of those remote dirt runway destinations. The city had a modern airport with a 6,000-foot runway, complete with an instrument landing system, ILS, and full approach lighting. But there was one glaring limitation. Cranbrook lacked a control tower. Now, this wasn't an uncommon situation for the pilots of PWA. The airline routinely served untowered airports, and the crew on this flight was well versed in flying in and out of such airports. The captain, a 30-year-old veteran with over 5,200 flight hours, had spent much of his career flying the Boeing 737. His first officer, younger at 25, was still relatively new, with only 1,300 total flight hours and just 81 on the 737. But he too was familiar with untowered airports. Before departure, the pilots completed a thorough pre-flight check. The aircraft was in good working order, and nothing in the technical log indicated any issues. The only complication was the weather. Cranbrook had been hit with heavy snow during the morning, and although the snowfall had lightened by the time of their flight, visibility was reduced to about 3/4 of a mile, 200 meters. While this wasn't ideal, the ILS at Cranbrook meant that the pilots could still safely land despite the poor visibility. This kind of weather was common in the mountainous region during winter. With that in mind, the pilots proceeded with the flight. The aircraft, carrying 44 passengers and 5 crew members, left Calgary as scheduled. As the Boeing 737 powered up its 2 JT-8D engines and began its takeoff roll at 12:32 local time, a critical event was quietly unfolding at Calgary's Air Traffic Control Tower. It was routine for controllers to provide an estimated time of arrival, ETA, for arriving flights to their destination airports. The ETA was typically based on the time an aircraft would pass over a specific navigation aid, like the non-directional radio beacon near Cranbrook, known as Sierra X-ray, which was used for the approach. However, in the case of PWA Flight 314, there was a significant flaw in the process. The Canadian Air Traffic Control (ATC) manual at the time didn't offer clear guidance on how to calculate an ETA. Controllers were left to use their discretion, often relying on their own judgment, which led to discrepancies in the estimated times. For PWA, the flight from Calgary to Cranbrook typically took about 25 minutes, with very little variation. In fact, the ground staff at Calgary had an ETA for the flight that was accurate to within 1 minute. But this information was kept within the airline and wasn't shared with external controllers. Here's where things took a turn. Air traffic control in Calgary, unaware of the operational accuracy PWA maintained in their flight times, made assumptions based on outdated or general procedures, leading to an inaccurate ETA calculation for Flight 314's approach. They didn't fully account for the specifics of the route the aircraft would take, which would ultimately set the stage for a deadly miscommunication. In aviation, a small error in calculating an ETA may seem minor. But, as this tragic story shows, it can be the spark that ignites a catastrophic chain of events. This situation echoes a similar issue seen in other aviation accidents, such as the 1977 Tenerife disaster, where miscommunications and discrepancies in flight paths contributed to a fatal collision on the runway. In both cases, the failure to correctly manage crucial operational information, whether it's timing, weather, or approach procedures, led to disastrous consequences. The rest of Flight 314's story is one of missteps, where one small miscalculation, coupled with a series of overlooked details, set off a sequence of events that no one could have predicted. Stay tuned as we explore the unfolding of these critical moments and what could have been done to prevent it. The miscalculations in the handling of Flight 314 were mounting, and as the aircraft made its way toward Cranbrook, a series of critical errors were unfolding on the ground. While PWA's internal team predicted the plane would arrive at 12:55 p.m., Canadian Air Traffic Control, ATC, estimated a 10-minute delay, setting the aircraft's expected arrival time at 1:05 p.m. This timing discrepancy would soon cause a misalignment in how the flight's approach was managed, and set the stage for the disaster that was about to unfold. To understand this, we need to look at the communication infrastructure in place at Cranbrook. While the airport didn't have a full-fledged control tower, it did have an air radio operator, a position that exists in many countries, albeit with varying titles. These operators provide advisory information on weather conditions, other aircraft in the vicinity, and crucially, ground vehicle movements on the runway. However, unlike air traffic controllers, air radio operators do not have the authority to give direct instructions to aircraft, like clearing a plane for takeoff or guiding them on approach. Their role is advisory, and in this case, it became a weak link in the safety chain. The Cranbrook air radio operator, who had been in the position for 5 years, was primarily concerned with keeping the runway clear of obstructions, like snowplows, which were vital given the weather conditions. On the day of the incident, snow was still falling, and a snowplow had been tasked with clearing the runway between scheduled arrivals. The operator had been advised by Calgary ATC that Flight 314 would be arriving at 1:05 p.m., so he assumed, based on his manual, that the snowplow should be cleared from the runway at 1 p.m., 5 minutes prior to the ETA. However, here's where the disconnect occurred. The Cranbrook Air Radio Operator's Manual recommended this 5-minute buffer between the snowplow clearing the runway and the arrival of an aircraft, but it was based on unofficial guidelines and lacked the regulatory weight of formal aviation protocols. Additionally, the ETA provided by Calgary was never intended to manage the coordination between ground vehicles and aircraft. These discrepancies in procedure were compounded by the fact that the air radio operator had no formal training or official guidance for such a situation. The snowplow was on track to be cleared at 1 p.m., even though Flight 314 was not expected to arrive until 1:05 p.m. The air radio operator, assuming the ETA from Calgary was accurate, gave no further instruction to delay the snowplow's departure, leaving it on the runway as Flight 314 approached. This gap in protocol mirrors what happened in another tragic aviation incident, the 1977 Tenerife disaster. In that case, miscommunication about timing and operational procedures between air traffic controllers and ground crew members led to the collision of 2 aircraft on the runway. Similarly, the gap between the snowplow's removal and the aircraft's approach on Flight 314 was about to have serious consequences. The inaccurate ETA, combined with the absence of standardized communication between ATC and the ground staff, set the stage for a tragic event. Now, we need to turn our attention to the aircraft itself, the Boeing 737-200. This aircraft, while a reliable workhorse for airlines like PWA, had certain design features that would become crucial in the unfolding scenario. One such feature was the thrust reversers, which are designed to help slow the aircraft down after landing or in the event of a rejected takeoff. Thrust reversers work by redirecting the engine's thrust forward, helping to decelerate the aircraft more quickly. While this system is loud and noticeable to passengers, it primarily serves as a supplemental braking mechanism. The real deceleration still comes from the regular wheel brakes, but thrust reversers can be a vital tool when the runway conditions are slippery or wet, as they reduce the reliance on wheel brakes, helping to prevent excessive brake temperatures. In this case, as Flight 314 approached a runway that had been inadequately cleared of snow, the thrust reversers would play a crucial role in the aircraft's ability to stop in time if something went wrong. Unfortunately, the lack of coordination between the timing of the snowplow's departure and the actual arrival time of the flight would lead to a situation where the aircraft's ability to use these systems would be compromised. What had started as a routine flight was now on a collision course with a chain of events that no one could have anticipated, and the next phase of the flight would bring the crew and passengers closer to disaster. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into what happened next. As we continue to explore the intricate details of this ill-fated flight, we need to delve into the aircraft's design, specifically the thrust reversers, which would play a key role in the events that followed. The Boeing 737-200, like most transport category jets, was equipped with thrust reversers to aid in decelerating the aircraft after landing or in the event of a rejected takeoff. However, the way these reversers worked and the potential for malfunction would contribute to the unfolding crisis. Thrust reversers are mechanisms that redirect engine thrust forward to help slow the aircraft down more effectively. In the case of the 737-200, these reversers are known as bucket-style reversers. When deployed, bucket doors physically deflect the exhaust airflow forward, assisting with braking. For the pilots to deploy these reversers, the thrust levers must first be in the idle position to prevent any forward thrust. Once in idle, the pilot can move the reversal levers, which are connected to the thrust levers, activating the hydraulic systems to open the bucket doors. Once the doors are fully open, the engines are spooled up to provide additional reverse thrust. The pilot can then reduce the power by moving the reversal levers back to the neutral position, which also causes the bucket doors to close. However, the thrust reversers are not a simple on and off system. They rely on a precise sequence of actions to operate effectively. This system is crucial when the runway conditions are less than ideal, such as when it's wet or slippery, as it helps reduce the wear on wheel brakes and facilitates a quicker turnaround. But here's the catch. While thrust reversers are an essential tool on the ground, they can be catastrophic if deployed in the air. The design of the 737-200's reverser system includes multiple lockout mechanisms to prevent their activation in flight. One of these systems requires the thrust levers to be in idle position before the reverser levers can be moved. Furthermore, another lockout mechanism prevents forward thrust from being applied when the bucket doors are open. This is a critical safety feature, as the thrust reversers are intended only for ground use and would cause severe control issues if activated in flight. Yet the system's design had a significant flaw. The lockout was controlled by a rotating cam mechanism, rather than a binary solenoid or electrical switch. This allowed for a range of positions in which the bucket doors could be partially open, and the thrust could be partially applied. In theory, this meant that a pilot could begin to apply forward thrust even if the bucket doors were not fully closed, creating a dangerous scenario, especially if the aircraft was airborne. But there was an additional safeguard. The 737-200 also employed an air-ground interlock, which detected whether the aircraft was on the ground or airborne. If the aircraft had taken off, the system would cut hydraulic power to the reverser actuating system, preventing the doors from being deployed or staying open. However, this system relied on the weight-on-wheels switches to detect whether the aircraft was on the ground, and once airborne, it would deactivate the hydraulic power to the reversers. The problem arose if the reversers were deployed while the aircraft was still on the ground, and the system failed to properly close the bucket doors before takeoff. In this case, once airborne, there would be no hydraulic power to close the doors, leaving the aircraft with partially deployed reversers. This issue wasn't theoretical. It had been flagged in the late 1970s. In 1977, Boeing added a caution in the Flight Crew Operations Manual, warning pilots that attempting to go around after deploying the reversers could result in one or more reversers remaining stuck in the open position. As a result, going around after deploying the reversers became strictly prohibited. Interestingly, PWA pilots were well aware of this potential risk. Despite the caution, many of their colleagues had successfully performed go-arounds after deploying the reversers on numerous occasions, without any immediate incidents. However, this routine maneuver would soon come back to haunt them, as the system's flaws, combined with the mismanagement of time and coordination on the ground, would create a scenario where the aircraft was now in a precarious situation. While the reversers were designed for specific use on the ground, the knowledge that some pilots had done go-arounds without incident fostered a false sense of confidence. The series of errors in judgment, both in the air and on the ground, was setting the stage for an unfolding disaster. In the next segment, we'll see how this complex interplay of mechanical failure, human error, and miscommunication would culminate in tragedy. Stay with us as we break down what went wrong and the lessons learned from this unfortunate event. At this stage of the flight, we are beginning to see the subtle yet critical interplay of technical systems and human factors that would contribute to the disaster. The Boeing 737-200, as we've discussed, had a complex thrust reverser system designed for safety, but it wasn't foolproof. In the event that a reverser was stuck open in flight, the aircraft could still be controlled, though not ideally. The aircraft had thrust reversal override switches that could restore hydraulic power to the system, allowing the pilots to stow the reversers if needed. These overrides were housed on the rear overhead panel, behind the pilots, and each switch was guarded by a protective cover and a witness wire to ensure that it wasn't accidentally activated. If a reverser failed to close properly, a warning light would illuminate, prompting the crew to take action according to emergency procedures. It's important to keep this technical detail in mind, as it plays a pivotal role in the aircraft's operations, and we'll return to it later in the story. Meanwhile, Flight 314 had reached its cruising altitude of 20,000 feet and was on its way to Cranbrook. Despite the short flight duration, at just 12:42 p.m., only 4 minutes into the cruise, the first officer contacted Calgary ATC to begin the descent. The controller cleared the flight to begin its descent and provided the local altimeter setting. 2 minutes later, as the plane was descending through 18,000 feet, the crew switched frequencies to contact the Cranbrook air radio operator, who was monitoring conditions at the airport. The operator reported that the weather was still poor, with visibility reduced to around 3/4 of a mile due to snow, and that the wind was coming from 150 degrees at 6 knots. However, the air radio operator also provided some critical information about the snowplow still clearing the runway. "The sweeper on the runway has been for some time trying to keep snow back for you," he said. "I'll let you know what it's like as soon as I get a progress from him." The first officer acknowledged this and responded simply with 314 checks. But here's where things began to slip through the cracks, literally and figuratively. It turns out that the captain, who was the pilot flying at the time, wasn't even listening to the Cranbrook air radio transmission. Instead, his radio was tuned to a company frequency, and he was engaged in a casual conversation with another PWA pilot about the stock market and other off-topic matters. Now, in 1978, the sterile cockpit rule, the regulation that prohibits pilots from engaging in non-operational conversations during critical flight phases, did not yet exist. While the sterile cockpit rule wouldn't have applied above 10,000 feet, this flight was approaching its descent into a challenging airport with snow and reduced visibility. The captain's failure to listen to the radio operator's crucial message about the snowplow on the runway is a critical moment. The fact that the captain felt comfortable having an idle conversation, despite the challenging conditions, suggests a level of complacency and perhaps a sense of overconfidence in the routine nature of the flight. It's easy to imagine that after numerous similar flights, the captain might have grown too accustomed to the procedure, which led to this lapse in attention. This lapse in concentration would later become a controversial point in the investigation. The flight crew's distraction during this critical phase of the flight wasn't listed as a contributing factor in the final accident report, even though many investigators later stated privately that it should have been. One investigator even remarked that the lack of focus in the cockpit was unprofessional and poorly disciplined, with some expressing frustration that pressure from the airline led to the exclusion of this factor from the final report. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see how the lack of a sterile cockpit policy and an overly casual approach to flight operations contributed to this critical breakdown. At PWA in 1978, there was a culture that didn't prioritize the strict discipline and focus required during the descent into a potentially hazardous airport. This casual atmosphere would ultimately play a role in the unfortunate events that followed, where attention to detail and communication could have made all the difference. As we continue, we'll examine how this mix of human factors, flawed systems, and poor communication would lead Flight 314 down a path of irreversible consequences, culminating in a tragic accident that might have been prevented with better protocols, better training, and more vigilance in the cockpit. Stay with us as we break down the final moments and the crucial lessons learned from this incident. The unfolding disaster was now in its final, tragic stages, and as we approach the moment of impact, we see how a series of human errors, miscommunications, and procedural lapses would converge into catastrophe. Let's break down the critical moments leading up to the crash, where poor decision-making and a lack of coordination turned a routine approach into a deadly disaster. The first officer, as we've noted, failed to communicate the critical detail about the snowplow on the runway to the captain. We don't know exactly why this happened, whether it was due to distraction, misinterpretation, or simply not processing the full meaning of the air radio operator's message. But it's clear that something went wrong in the cockpit. The message from the air radio operator could have been interpreted in two ways. Either the snowplow was still on the runway and would be called back after completing its task, or the snowplow had already finished and the operator was just waiting for confirmation. Given the distractions of the cockpit and the routine nature of the flight, it's understandable that the first officer might have missed the critical detail that the snowplow was still on the runway. This miscommunication set off a chain of events that would soon lead to disaster. Cranbrook, being an untowered airport, lacked radar to track the aircraft's position. It was common practice for pilots approaching Cranbrook to report their position as they crossed the Schwann beacon, which would give the air radio operator a sense of how far the flight was from landing. But the crew of Flight 314, either distracted or unaware of the importance of this report, did not make this call. This failure to report their position left the air radio operator in the dark about when the flight was actually approaching. The air radio operator, assuming the flight was still far from the airport, did not instruct the snowplow to vacate the runway. Had the pilots made the standard position report, the operator would have realized the flight was only 5 minutes from landing and could have told the snowplow to clear the runway. This simple step, however, was missed, and the snowplow remained on the runway, completely unaware of the approaching aircraft. As Flight 314 continued its approach using the ILS, the pilot still had no visibility of the runway, obscured as it was by the heavy snowfall. The approach lights and runway lights became visible before the actual surface of the runway, and the snowplow, facing away from the aircraft, was further hidden by the plume of snow being thrown up by its brush. The snowplow driver, meanwhile, couldn't see the airplane coming because it was approaching from behind him. This created a perfect storm of confusion. Both the pilots and the snowplow driver were unaware of each other's presence. With the air radio operator unable to provide oversight due to the lack of a control tower, no one on the ground was aware of the imminent danger. This was a catastrophic lapse in communication. As the aircraft continued its approach, the pilots had no idea they were heading toward an obstacle on the runway. At 12:55 p.m., Flight 314 touched down on runway 16, approximately 800 feet down the runway. As the captain immediately applied reverse thrust to slow the aircraft, he suddenly spotted the snowplow directly in front of him. This moment would have been terrifying for the pilots, as it became immediately obvious that they were about to crash into the snowplow. The captain had no time to react, and the aircraft was now on a direct collision course with the snowplow. In aviation, situations like this are a nightmare scenario. The aircraft, now on the ground, was slowing down with reverse thrust, but the snowplow was directly in its path. The moment of impact seemed inevitable, and the pilots had no chance to avoid it. The sequence of events, miscommunication, missed reports, inadequate ground control procedures, and lack of visibility, had culminated in a situation where there was no time to prevent disaster. What followed was tragic. The collision between PWA Flight 314 and the snowplow marked the end of a routine flight, which had turned into an aviation disaster due to a series of preventable errors. The failure to communicate effectively, the lack of attention to critical details, and the absence of clear regulations for snow removal procedures at untowered airports all contributed to the disaster. These lessons, though learned the hard way, shaped future safety protocols and the way that both pilots and ground crews approach such situations. This is an example of how small lapses, when compounded, can lead to catastrophic results, reminding us of the importance of attention to detail, strict adherence to procedures, and clear communication in aviation. As the captain instinctively initiated the go-around, the situation began to spiral out of control, one mistake cascading into another. In a moment of pure reflex, the captain called for the go-around, pushed the thrust levers forward, and engaged the toga thrust to climb away from the runway. It's possible that the first officer, startled by the sudden decision, also attempted to move the thrust levers at the same time. Medical examinations later suggested that the captain may have fractured his thumb when the first officer inadvertently pinned his hand against the thrust levers, adding physical pain to an already chaotic situation. However, this injury, while significant, wasn't the most pressing concern. In his rush to abort the landing, the captain failed to notice that the left thrust reverser doors hadn't fully closed. This was a critical oversight. As the captain began to push the thrust levers forward, he inadvertently allowed the lockout cam system to release, which partially freed the thrust reverser from its locked position. When the aircraft started to rotate to take off, lifting the main landing gear off the runway, the weight-on-wheel switches were de-energized, cutting hydraulic power to the thrust reverser system. With the doors still about 4 or 5 centimeters from fully closed, the force of the airflow began to push the bucket doors open again. As the left thrust reverser doors opened in flight, a safety system detected the asymmetric deployment of the reverser and automatically moved the left thrust lever to idle to prevent full reverse thrust from developing. However, this still left the aircraft with a severe imbalance between thrust and drag, exacerbated by the deployment of the reversers and the loss of thrust from the left engine. As the aircraft climbed, the captain and first officer were left fighting against a plane that was losing speed and struggling to stay in the air. The 737 cleared the top of the snowplow by a mere 50 feet. The snowplow driver, who was facing away from the aircraft, exclaimed in disbelief, "Where the hell did he come from?" On board the aircraft, the cockpit must have been in utter chaos. The pilots were grappling with the surprise of seeing the snowplow, the confusion caused by the thrust reverser deployment, and the pain from the captain's possible injury. To counteract the yaw caused by the asymmetrical thrust, both pilots applied right rudder and right aileron to correct the aircraft's flight path. But the plane was now at the absolute limits of what was theoretically possible. In their confusion and stress, the pilots forgot to retract the flaps and landing gear, which only increased drag and exacerbated the aircraft's loss of airspeed. As the plane continued to lose speed, they found themselves in a dangerously low-speed regime, where the authority of the flight controls was significantly reduced. The loss of control was now imminent. Then, in one of the most critical moments of the flight, the pilots made a fatal error. One of them momentarily stopped applying right rudder, which caused the aircraft to yaw sharply to the left, initiating a roll that quickly became uncontrollable. Investigators later speculated that, in the midst of the chaos, one of the pilots might have seen the thrust reverser warning light and tried to activate the emergency override switch to close the reverser doors. However, the switch was found in an open position and the witness wire was broken, indicating that the pilots may have attempted to reach the switch, but were unable to complete the action in time. With the aircraft now in a steep left bank and rapidly losing control, recovery became impossible due to the low speed. Just moments before impact, the pilots were heard on the air radio frequency, shouting, "We are gonna crash!" Despite the desperate attempts to regain control, stomping on the right rudder and retracting the flaps to 15 degrees, it was too late. The aircraft banked over 90 degrees to the left and crashed less than 20 seconds after the go-around was initiated. Upon impact, the front of the plane broke apart, and the center wing section exploded when the fuel tanks ignited. Almost everyone on board was killed instantly in the crash and subsequent fire. However, miraculously, the tail section remained mostly intact. A flight attendant and one passenger managed to escape through one of the rear exit doors, while 3 other passengers were able to escape through a break in the fuselage. One passenger was ejected from the plane during the crash, surviving after landing in deep snow, still strapped in his seat. Rescue crews were unable to reach the wreckage due to the deep snow, and firefighters and witnesses had to reach the scene on foot. They managed to find the surviving passenger inside the forward cabin, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the randomness of survival in such catastrophic events. This tragic accident underscores the importance of discipline, communication, and strict adherence to safety protocols, particularly in high-stress situations. The breakdowns in communication, the failure to follow procedures, and the cascading errors that led to the loss of control all contributed to a disaster that could have been avoided. It serves as a powerful reminder of the need for constant vigilance, clear communication, and never allowing complacency to enter the cockpit. The aftermath of this tragic accident left a profound impact on aviation safety. While one of the passengers initially survived the crash, he ultimately passed away in the hospital a few days later, leaving only 6 survivors from the flight. A total of 43 lives were lost in the crash and subsequent fire. The investigation into the disaster was severely hampered by fire damage to both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. However, through painstaking efforts, investigators were able to pinpoint several critical contributing factors that led to the crash. The primary causes included an incorrect estimated time of arrival, ETA, from Calgary ATC, the pilot's failure to report crossing the beacon, the deployment of the left thrust reverser during flight, inadequate regulations governing communications at uncontrolled airports, and the inability of the Boeing 737 to safely perform a go-around after reverse thrust was deployed upon touchdown. The investigation also revealed significant gaps in the regulations for handling operations at uncontrolled airports, particularly during adverse weather. At the time of the accident, there were no clear or standardized procedures to address situations like the one at Cranbrook. In response to this crash, there was a shift in how such procedures were formalized and regulated. Today, pilots, air traffic controllers, and advisory services at uncontrolled airports have much more structured and formalized communication processes to ensure clear and precise coordination, an effort designed to prevent the miscommunications that led to the disaster. Perhaps one of the most notable changes in the wake of this accident was the realization that, for airlines like PWA, which operated large jets into small, uncontrolled airports under poor weather conditions, the ability to safely execute a go-around after-thrust reverser deployment was a critical safety need. Prior to this accident, no aircraft had been required to demonstrate this capability in certification testing. But as a direct result of this tragedy, Canada became one of the only countries to mandate that aircraft manufacturers demonstrate during certification that their aircraft could safely perform a go-around after-thrust reverser deployment. This change has since made its way into aviation practices worldwide. This maneuver, now known as the Cranbrook maneuver, became a key learning point for aviation safety. It highlighted the need for better designed lockout systems in thrust reverser mechanisms to ensure that reversers stay stowed when the aircraft is in the air, preventing unintended deployment. In addition, pilot training has been enhanced to reduce the likelihood of attempts to execute the Cranbrook maneuver in the first place. This focus on improvement in thrust reverser systems and training has continued, as even today's advanced systems are not foolproof. Modern-day pilots, like those on a TAP Portugal flight, have learned this lesson the hard way. Despite all these improvements, the Cranbrook accident remains a sobering reminder of how a series of small missteps can cascade into a catastrophe. The impact of the Cranbrook disaster is still felt today, with rigorous safety standards, improved technology, and better pilot training helping to prevent similar accidents. The legacy of this event is one of increased awareness, accountability, and a dedication to ensuring that every detail of aviation safety is addressed, no matter how small it may seem. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a pivotal moment in aviation history. If you'd like to see more content like this, or be the first to watch my next video, please visit patreon.com, join Mentor Pilot, and sign up. My name is Pet Hofeld, and you've been watching Mentor Pilot. I hope you have a fantastic day. Goodbye.